Good morning, guys. How are you doing today?
Well, sir, I've been sleeping through Father Zoom, so I think I'm gonna need you to bless me some info on feudalism.
Always lacking, Mr. Fazl. At least it's always a fun topic to wake you up. What have you guys learned so far?
Oh yeah, there's actually a bit. Feudalism was first seen in ancient Rome, and feudalism is basically a social hierarchy system in which all roles are codependent on one another. However, the lords oversaw all of their land and provided protection to the serfs in some of the lower levels of the social hierarchy. And some lords even became more powerful than the king himself.
Where is feudalism first seen? Feudalism was first seen in the ancient Roman manorial system, in which workers were compensated with their protection in return for living on large estates of land and working this land and help maintaining the land. It later could be seen again in history around the eighth century, in which the kingdom of the Franks and a king would give out benefices to other nobles and people who helped him serve in the military or helped fund it. This allowed nobles to keep tighter control over their land and even develop them into some country-like city-states that grew more powerful than the king himself. How did feudalism work, and what was the structure around it? The way feudalism worked was that it was a social hierarchy system. And the way that this worked were that lower tiers, such as serfs and peasants, would help work and gather crops from the land owned by the lords, who were freemen, and then would pay small taxation to vassals, which would come in the form of their product that they grow. Actually, not too small, but majority of it. They would be given a little bit to live off of, and they would also be granted protection and legal, both protection military-wise and legally, in compensation for their food and taxation living on the lord's land. How and why did feudalism develop in Europe during the early 800 BC? So the reason why feudalism developed and happened in Europe is due to the large amount of invaders of Europe and the high threat level of Europe at the time. So during this time, Europe was being attacked from all directions, north, south, east, and west, and was under constant threat. This led lower peasants and serfs who were not able to protect themselves to flee to their local lords, who were granted land by the Frankish king at the time in compensation for their service within the militia. Now, this was this ended up leading to a social hierarchy system known today as feudalism or the manorial system, and this ended up with a tier system. And the tier system ran with the king obviously at the highest point himself, nobles, also known as lords often, and then knights and vassals, and then after that merchants, farmers, and craftsmen, and then below that the lowest level peasants and serfs who brutally worked the land and were given not much compensation in return for their land. However, they were granted protected land under the king by the knights, and they were allowed to feed their family and themselves. And that was a good enough arrangement and deal for them to allow them to continue working for the lords. Because if they didn't, like I said earlier, Europe was under attack in all directions. If they didn't, they would just then end up being, probably killed by the invaders, the Vikings and the Moors and all those different threats and stuff. So they found it was a better way to just stay with their lord and work the land as best they could, and the lord would grant them protection through the knights, and the knights would receive the food from the serfs. So it was a social hierarchy system that constantly depended on each other, and with all different tiers working together to create a societal bound, kind of.
All right. What about the significance of the time period feudalism was relevant?
Well, Mr. Kiel, throughout the Middle Ages, almost all of Europe and parts of Asia were conducted and run by the feudal system. The system was a chain of command starting from the king, which went all the way down to serfs and peasants.
With each different chain, there was a trade-off or a contract between both parties that they agreed on. For example, The knight would give the peasants food and protection in exchange for farmland and rent. The church also had its own internal feudal system, and in many cases it was as powerful or more powerful than the king. Under the feudal system, monasteries were considered institutes of high learning, and as they became more powerful and wealthy, the more economic relevancy and power they had in the feudal world, and thus helped monasticism thrive as an economic power. Feudalism also affected papacy by making popes, bishops, and abbots more than just a spiritual role, and became a role with wealth and economic power. As the feudal system is a chain of command which was prominently used all over the world in the Middle Ages, it affects the way the church was looked at, as making it a powerful economic force. However, feudalism did not contribute to any beliefs or customs that existed in the church, or create any new ones within the church. Feudalism did not have an effect on what the church taught and its beliefs, but more about how the church was run as a powerful part of the feudal system. With the rise of feudalism and some of the conflicts that arose with it, feudalism helped introduce more into the political life and a bond of legalities between the two different parties within the feudal system itself. Almost every war during the Middle Ages, or the feudal times, was based on some legal claim. Political expediency or national expansion were unknown doctrines within the church. When these problems did arise, the church had to decide what was right and what was wrong by creating new doctrines that stated so. For example, the feudal land tenure was something that many people had seen as unfair, as some lords were giving tenures that were free and some that weren't. This caused many moral and ethical debates within the church, and therefore had to be decided if it was morally right to do so. This showing how the feudal system helped create new doctrines within the church. Feudalism has a very large impact on history and has helped shape the world as we see it today. First, feudalism discouraged unified governments. Lords would divide their land into smaller and smaller sections to give to lesser rulers and knights. These lesser noblemen would subdivide their own lands into even smaller fiefs to give to less important landlords. Each landlord would be loyal to the person who gave them the land, which was not necessarily the king or higher nobleman. Feudal government was always an arrangement between individuals, not between countries or states. It meant that while individual barons, dukes, and earls might be loyal to the king or a centralized noble family, there was no strong legal tradition to prevent them from declaring war on each other. Second, feudalism discouraged trade and economic growth. The land was worked by peasants and farmers called serfs, who were tied to individual plots of land and forbidden to change or move occupation without the permission of their landlord. The feudal lord would get a portion of the produce in taxes and fees, and the serfs owed him a set of numbered days in which they would work on the lord's fields in exchange for the right to work on their own land. The trade-off in turn helped create and inspire some of the structures in the countries that we see today.
That's awesome. Now, can you connect any of that into our society today? You guys know anything about the implications in the modern church?
Of course, sir. Well, I connected to how arms dealing, where countries give weapons and arms in return for support in any upcoming war, and land to have for setting up bases and camps, to the main idea of feudalism.
In essence, for example, America could go, here are a bunch of weapons. We are now the higher power. But in return, I want to make sure that you are an ally. You stand by our side. We could hypothetically go to war right now. And now, you countries are obliged to support each side of the war due to contractual agreements and the people that fall under this feudal way of life. Feudalism took us away from salvation history. It separated us from a true Christian way of life. Instead of doing things out of the generosity of our hearts, we made contracts and agreements just so we could have materialistic things. Here's another present-day example: the mafia. These are Catholic people pushing away others from God, away from salvation history. You are a brother of the mafia, and you must do what the higher-ups, the padres, say for you, in exchange for protection of your families. The mafia can visit a business and tell them that they must pay money to them in exchange for protection from mysterious fires or other things that could happen if they don't pay tax. These come similar to the feudal way of life back in the medieval times. Today, our lives are focused on materialistic things. We have put consumerism on a pedestal. We've lost our connection to God, to salvation history. The idea of feudalism has forced some people back in the medieval times, and even in today's society, to care more about and resort to needing more material things in order to be happier and to feel fulfillment in life. In terms of the mafia and arms dealing examples, to gain a greater grasp on society, the lords, our higher-ups, have shown their power and the idea that some people have no other choice than to accept protection, than to accept land, than to accept these things for sacrificing their freedoms, themselves, and their money. Greed and selfishness has truly taken away us from God.
Boom. You guys did the project yourselves.
Geez, you got me, sir. You got me.
And right there is a completed Kerygma as well. All we got to do now is Our Lady Seat of Wisdom,
Pray for us.
St. Michael the Archangel,
Pray for us.
and Basil the Great.
Pray for us.